Okay, the second of our online presentations is on the organisation of the respiratory system. Because it's a fairly big topic, I'll break the presentation into two, and for this online presentation I'll focus on the conducting zone. That is, and we'll talk about it later, the regions of the respiratory system that are involved in the movement of the air from the atmosphere to the lungs, and that don't participate in gas exchange. And in the next online presentation, that is OL3, I'll focus on the respiratory zone, that is, the microscopic regions of the respiratory system that are involved in gas exchange. But all that will become much more clear as we go along. So if we start with this presentation on the organisation or the components of the respiratory system that make up the conducting zone, I refer you to a diagram that is found in your textbook Widmeyer figure 13.1. Now in fact this diagram comes from Mariev, I think, but it's similar to the one in Widmeyer figure 13.1. So if we look at the components of the respiratory system, we see that we've got two apertures through which the atmospheric air can enter and exit the body. That is the nose and the mouth. Humans are relatively unusual in that we have those two options and that we both use fairly frequently. Just from memory, don't quote me on this, but I know that horses can't breathe through their mouths and that dogs and cats can, but they do so very infrequently, so they prefer to breathe through their nose or nares. So why do we have these two options? That is. So why do humans have these two options? Well, I guess we probably all know, even though we probably don't think about it a lot, that breathing through the nose is the preferred option because it has a variety of anatomical features which help protect the lungs, and we'll get to those in a moment. A disadvantage of breathing through the nose, however, is that the apertures through which we breathe, that is the nares or the nostrils, offer a significant resistance to the movement of large volumes of air. So for example, if you're exercising intensely and you need to breathe in large volumes of air, it's more difficult to do so through the nostrils because of their size offering quite a large resistance to the movement, because of their small diameter. So you find that when you need to breathe these large volumes of air, you tend to breathe through the mouth, much bigger aperture. But let's concentrate firstly on breathing through the nose, since it's the preferred mechanism with normal, quiet breathing. As I mentioned previously, air enters the respiratory system through the apertures of the nose called the nostrils, or nares, N-A-R-E-S is the alternate nomenclature. It then moves, as you can see, into the nasal cavity, this region here. The first part of the nasal cavity, as you know, is lined with hairs which aid in the removal of coarse particles, that is dust and pollen, for example. It's also lined with a variety of secretory cells which secrete both mucus and a more watery or liquid secretion. The sticky mucus functions to trap large particles, again looking at things like dust, pollen, even bacteria, which may have been inspired in the air that we breathe from the atmosphere. Whereas the watery secretions I was talking about contain things called lysozymes, L-Y-S-O-Z-Y-M-E-S, lysozymes, you might have heard of them before, which have an immune function. They are able to attack and destroy the bacteria and other microbes that might have been inhaled from the atmosphere through the nose. These smaller hairs, though, in the nasal cavity move the mucus and the fluid that I was just talking about back to the throat or the pharynx, where it's ultimately swallowed. Now that sounds particularly gross, but it's not, in that the very low pH, or the acid environment of the stomach, is fantastic for destroying any bacteria or pathogens. So it's a really good way of removing them from the body and their effects that could be gained in from the body. So it removes all those bad bacterial effects. Now, back to this fluid, we produce about 200 mils on average of fluid a day from this region. So as I said, it plays a big role in the removal of large particles and, as we'll see later, protects the very delicate structures of the lung from infection. So important protective role. A side story, I've got lots of them. A side story is that when it's cold and the movement of those hairs becomes sluggish and the liquid's then not able to be moved back to the throat effectively, that excess liquid then has no option but to dribble out of the nose, and that's why you get a runny nose on, or you may get a runny nose on cold days. Similarly, when the nasal cavity becomes inflamed due to infection or a cold or whatever, and you produce many more secretions that exceed our capacity to move the fluid to the throat, it again can't be removed effectively and runs out of the nose. Another function, and I promise I won't go on about to this extent to all the other structures that I'm about to speak about, but another function of the fluid is that it humidifies the air as it moves through the nasal cavity. So if you're moving large volumes of air rapidly through the nasal cavity, the process of the air moving quickly through that cavity, which is has a lot of liquid lining the walls, is that it humidifies the air. That, in combination with the fact that the nasal cavity is richly supplied with blood vessels, means that you're able to humidify and warm the air before it travels down through the airways. Now, if you've ever exercised or gone for a run on a really cold, dry morning, you know that that would constrict the airways and it makes it much more difficult to breathe. So warming and humidifying the air keeps the airways open, the airways progressing to the lungs open, and makes the process offering less resistance and makes the process of breathing much more easy. The other thing about the nasal cavity is that you can see that we've got these membrane-coated cartilaginous plates, to which I'm pointing here. You can see 3 of them projecting medially from the sides of the nasal cavity, and these are called, although I'm sorry they're unlabeled here, they're called the nasal conchae. I'll spell that C-O-N-C-H-A-E, the nasal conchae. So these cartilaginous plates called the nasal conchae. Now these function to slow the movement of air by creating a turbulent flow. And really, why do you want to slow the movement of air? Well, basically to allow the process of humidification and warmth that I spoke about in the last couple of minutes to occur more effectively. So you can see that all the advantages of breathing through the nose, particularly with regard to protecting the delicate airways and the delicate structures of the lungs that we'll talk about later on. So we protect them from infection and consequent damage. Now, we'll move further on from the nasal cavity. So as air then leaves the nasal cavity, it then moves into an area called the pharynx, indicated here, which is also commonly called the throat, but the pharynx is its appropriate anatomical term. It's rather funnel-shaped, as you can see. It's probably about 13 centimetres in length, but don't get too worried about the actual dimensions of it all, but for what it's worth, about 13 centimetres in length. In terms of breathing, its main and probably only role is again to help filter the air that we breathe. You can see at the back of the pharynx here, the air must do probably about a 90-degree turn in order to progress down the airways. And it's doing it at a speed of, well, probably about 50 to 80 kilometers per hour. So the air that enters through the nasal cavity hits the back of the pharynx because it's being inspired at a speed of about 50 to 80 kilometers per hour. Now, if you think about it, particulate matter, that is little bits of dust and things that weren't filtered by the nose, the nasal hairs, and didn't attach to the mucus, so anything that escaped those two processes, basically because the particles are heavier than the air molecules, they're going to hit the back of the pharynx, this point here. Now the wall at this point is the site of something called pharyngeal tonsils. Now don't get these confused with the palatine tonsils that you sort of see if you open your mouth and look down into the throat. So these pharyngeal tonsils are also called adenoids, and they produce they're basically made up of immune producing cells, which again assist in the destruction of any inhaled pathogens, which again further protects the lungs. So that's another protective role of the pharynx. You can see it's also the pharynx is the region where the nasal cavity and the oral cavity of the mouth come together or join. From here, the air moves from the pharynx into the larynx. Now this structure of the larynx, which is sometimes called the voice box, but it's probably best called the larynx, is about 5 centimeters long, so it's not very big at all. In terms of the respiratory system, it only serves as the switching area between food and water. So basically, food and water that we ingest has to be sent posteriorly down the esophagus, which is not indicated in this diagram, and the air we breathe is then switched forward anteriorly to the trachea, where it can then travel to the lungs. So of course the larynx plays a big role in voice production, but this is outside the scope of the lectures here or the online presentation here. Now from the larynx, the air that we inhale is then travelling to a tubular structure called the trachea, or the windpipe, but again better called the trachea. As I said, this tube-like structure is about 10 to 12 centimeters in length and has a diameter of about 2 centimeters. But again, don't get too hung up on those particular dimensions. If we look at it in more detail, which I will in this slide here, so here we see, and again taken from Widmeyer, figure 13.3 of your textbook, here we have a section of the trachea here, and an enlargement of the wall of the trachea on the bottom left of the overhead, which I'll get to in a moment. So if we look at this slide here of the trachea, and this is anterior towards the front of the body, posteriorly towards the back of the body, and here's the section that we're looking at here. We see that the trachea basically is a tube made up particularly of smooth muscle. With these cartilaginous rings, so in blue we see the cartilaginous rings which intersperse the trachea about every centimetre or so. Now the function of these cartilaginous rings is to keep the airways patent or open, patent, fancy word for open, so it keeps the airways open at all times. In fact, if we look at it carefully, and you've probably already noted, that in fact the cartilaginous rings aren't rings at all, they're rather horseshoe shaped. And this is important because if they were rings, they would impede the movement of food as it passes through the esophagus, which as you can see lies posterior to the trachea. So if food was moving through the esophagus and expanding the esophagus, if you have the cartilaginous rings of the posterior part of the trachea, it would impede the movement of food as you needed to swallow and send it to the stomach. Obviously, that's why you don't have them. If we look at a the inner surface of the trachea. So in pink we have the smooth muscle, in blue we have the cartilaginous rings or horseshoe-shaped structures, and if we look at the internal lining of the trachea in a bit more detail, we need to focus our attention on the bottom left-hand side of this diagram. We see that it's made up of a number of cells. The main cells are these pseudo-stratified, ciliated, columnar epithelial cells. Now what the heck does that mean? The pseudo-stratified, which is not labelled here, but pseudo-stratified in the name, tells us that these cells are a single layer. They might look like they have many layers, so that's the pseudo bit, but in fact they are a single layer of cells. The epithelial, the columnar part, tells it that they look like columns. The epithelial part of the name tells us on the surface of the body. Remember, the airways are still part of the surface of the body. And the ciliated part obviously tells you that these hairs contain cilia, which you can see in this diagram. Fine structures. The other type of cells that we find lining the trachea are these sort of pineapple-shaped cells called goblet cells. There they are, goblet cells here, which, as the name, well, it doesn't really suggest it, but anytime you hear goblet cells, immediately think of mucus, because goblet cells' principal role is to produce mucus. And this mucus lines the internal wall of the trachea. Again, any particulate matter, particles you can see here that hasn't been filtered thus far in the structures we've already spoken about, stick to the tacky mucus layers, and the cilia move the mucus upwards towards the pharynx, where it is again swallowed, and therefore any pathogens can be destroyed by the acidic nature of the stomach. Now, as an aside, if you breathe air that's heavily contaminated with particulate matters, for example, somebody who smokes or somebody who lived in a very highly polluted environment, this mucus can be so trapped with particulate matter and consequently so heavy that these cilia can't move the particles upwards, and therefore you lose this capacity to further filter the air, and predisposes is why people who smoke or live in heavily polluted environments are much more predisposed to lung infections. Another aside is that people with cystic fibrosis secrete an altered mucus. It's a much thicker, heavier, tackier type of mucus, and again the cilia are not strong enough to move this mucus upwards, and this is one of the big problems of people with cystic fibrosis. They're predisposed to frequent lung infections and narrowed airways as the layer of mucus becomes very, very thick. So that's the role of the trachea. If we move back to the previous diagram, so we're now down to here, you can see at about the level of T7, thoracic 7, if you're doing anatomy, doesn't really matter. The trachea bifurcates, fancy word for divide into two bronchi, and each supplying a lung. So we've got the left bronchus and the right bronchus, collectively called bronchi, plural. These bronchi divide into two again, and they divide into two again, and this division into two occurs about 23 times, or 23 generations they call it, which means that a single trachea divides into approximately 5 million, right down. So if this is dividing into two, then they divide into two, and they divide into two, and they divide into two, you get the picture. Ultimately you get about 5 million very small narrow tubes with a collective length of about, useless fact, 2,500 kilometres. Pretty amazing, but pretty useless fact. Note that when the bronchi become so small that they lose their cartilaginous rings, and I think I've got a better picture later on, so now we see a bit more detail. Here's the bronchus dividing into two and dividing into two again. At some point when they become so narrow, they lose the cartilaginous rings. They're simply too small to have them, and at that point they're called bronchioles, which just simply means little bronchi. The final bronchioles have walls that are so thin, so if we look at the very last bronchioles, have walls that are so thin that in fact you get a small amount of gas exchange occurring. And for that reason we call them the respiratory bronchioles, because remember, respiration means gas exchange. So these respiratory bronchioles lead into the end of the airways, which are the alveoli, via the alveolar ducts. Now the alveoli are the site, these alveoli are the site of about 99.99% of the total gas exchange that occurs in the lungs, and so they're the major site of respiration. And this is what we'll discuss in online presentation number 3.